Karen, welcome to Free Your Voice.
Thank you, Dustin. It's so good to be here.
So, for audience that aren't familiar, Karen, you are quite an accomplished author on a topic that makes some people quite emotional and it makes others say it didn't happen or it didn't happen that way. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about your book? And then we'll go into this world called the Holocaust.
Irena's Gift is a World War II memoir about extraordinary women and the power of secrets and lies to tear a family apart. And it began with a letter my mum received when I was 9 from a stranger who told her that during World War II, she had been rescued by a notorious Nazi SS officer, and that the parents she thought were her parents were actually her aunt and uncle. And she kept that letter secret from me. And when I was a teenager, I found out that the grandparents I adored weren't actually my grandparents.
And how did this influence you? I mean, were you of the age of having some sort of emotional intelligence where you could understand what that even meant?
Well, I'd grown up with all these secrets around me. I knew that people were hiding things. For example, one of my earliest memories is when I was 4 or 5, my grandmother, the woman I thought was my grandmother, was chopping beets for a soup in the kitchen. And I was sitting at a banquette in the kitchen. And I asked her about the green numbers on her arm. And she didn't blink. And she said, "Oh, that's my phone number. I had it tattooed there especially, so I'd never forget it." And so I grew up with always feeling there wasn't something right. If I asked my questions, I didn't learn about the Holocaust at school like many of us do today. And I would ask my grandmother things like, "Oh, what's that? What's that big mark on your neck?" I didn't know then that she'd been in the Ravensbrück camp, and she said it's a birthmark. And so when I found out, I guess I was too young to really process what had happened. I remember just laughing hysterically and hiccuping in the same time. All of a sudden, I had this grandfather, biological new grandfather on the other side of the world that I didn't know about. So it was kind of novel, but obviously as I grew older, and particularly after my grandmother shared with me some of her experiences, the weight of what they endured began to dig deep into my soul.
I mean, it's remarkable that you have a connection to somebody that or to someone that had gone through this. This has to be for you a bit overwhelming at times that this group of people that they were terrorized, they were hunted, they were burned, they were killed, they were beaten. I mean, the trauma and it becomes generational, yet what I know about you seem pretty darn normal. So how did that trauma not totally mess you up because trauma is generational?
Well, I think I always thought the family I grew up in was pretty normal. But now I'm older, I realize it was very dysfunctional because my grandparents and my mother were hiding what happened to them behind this wall of silence. And it wasn't until the movie Schindler's List came out. If your listeners don't know about it, it was a Steven Spielberg movie that involved seeing people walk into the gas chambers of Auschwitz. And it wasn't until that movie came out that my grandmother called me and asked me to take her. She didn't ask my mother or her son. And so it was a week or so later, for the first time, she spoke about Auschwitz. She asked me to take her to a restaurant, and I was eating a risotto with shrimps. And she starts telling me about Dr. Mengele, who the Auschwitz prisoners called the angel of death, and how he would inspect her and the women standing in line next to her in his white gloves, and then he would pull women out of line to send them off to the gas chambers. And so in that moment, it was a real fork in the road for me because I realized she was telling me things she'd never told anybody else. And now I know, so asked about the transgenerational piece. Now I know because I studied it and I work with refugees from other wars that people often tell their grandchildren what they're, if they've been through horrible traumas, they often can't tell their own children. If they tell anyone, they tell their grandchildren. They couldn't believe what they went through themselves. How could they explain it to anybody else? And it takes a lot of time for them to be able to talk about it. And some people never talk about it.
Now, what do you think was in the mind of Hitler?
Oh,
What was in his, like, if you could ask him one, because you've done a lot of research now.
I
If you
have.
could ask him, like, you spend 30 minutes with Hitler and you're able to talk to him, what would you ask him?
Do you have a mother? Do you have a daughter? Do you have a son? People who you think are different are the same as you. You know, we're 99, we share 99%, 99.9% of our DNA with each other. How am I different to your daughter or your son? I don't know if he had kids, actually. Um, that's a really good question. Why did you do that to my family? I would probably ask him. What was really behind you wanting to do that to 6 million people? And not just the 6 million Jewish people who perished, but Roma, um, and gay people, black people. I don't know. I think looking back, we it's all very well to analyze history all this time later at the and to see history repeating itself. At the time, there were circumstances and different norms than there are today. But instinctively, I think he's the same as all of us. We all tend to be a little bit tribal. I remember I listened to one of your guests, Sir Mix-a-Lot, on your podcast, and he said we all need something to hate. We all need labels, and I think he's right. I loved a book that Isabel Wilkerson wrote called Caste, and I think we all need, and especially at times of turmoil. And in Germany, there was, after World War II, there was a depression. We all need someone to blame. We all need someone below us to make us feel better about ourselves. And I know Hitler took advantage of that, as other authoritarian leaders continue to do.
I mean, could there ever be reparations for what was done? I mean, how do you make all of that pain simply go away?
You don't. It never goes away. It's it's embedded in me. I mean, this necklace I'm wearing is my grandmother's, and I wear it every day because it's my yoke. I never forget what happened to her. And if you try and make it go away, that wall I talked about, for people who've experienced horrible traumas, they can show a different face to people. My grandmother used to say, she told me, after I actually interviewed her after Schindler's List, and she told me that they couldn't talk about this to anybody else but other people who'd been through the same thing. And when they got together with those people, that's all they could talk about it, because it was like a something lifting off their shoulders, being able to share with people how it's affecting them, because nobody else can understand what war and genocide is like unless you've been through that yourself, unless you've lost all your family. And sadly, there are too many people in the world today who are continuing to experience that.
And it's interesting because you've likely heard the saying that is power is never taken, it's given. That in that time period, that so much power was given to him, and yet people stood back. Now, one could argue if you stood up, something bad would happen. You had to drink the Kool-Aid and go along with it. But nonetheless, his ideology, why do you think that we need people to hate?
I want to tap into the people going along with it for a minute. I think that's really important, because I saw a really powerful picture recently of people raising their hands to Hitler, and one man who stood there with he was the only one in the crowd who didn't do the salute. And I think about that man, because I'm here talking to you today because a few people didn't go along with that hate. There were some people who people can read about in my book, people who saw my mother not necessarily as a Jewish child, but a little child who was sick, who was hungry, and who was crying for her mother. And I think that's really key today is if we humanize people. And so at the time of Hitler, and it wasn't only in Nazi Germany, it was in my grandparents' Poland as well. There was, and it didn't happen overnight, that the rhetoric and hate for people in another group, the dehumanizing that turned into violence. None of us really know what we're capable of until we're in a situation. I live in Boston, and when the Boston Marathon bombing happened, we all wanted to be the people who were running towards the victims, not those running away. But we actually never know what we're capable of until we're in a situation of chaos and violence. And I think I choose to think about not the people who hate. I think it's really important to focus on the people who didn't, who went against the flow, who had the courage to show kindness to people who were being discriminated against just because of their race.
It's interesting, Karen, because it's these moments that show you the people that we think have wronged us. Those moments in our own history or her story, the things we hold on to, we don't forgive people. I mean, imagine a group that had gone through this, such barbaric acts, and they have to now find a way to forgive because everywhere they turn, unless somebody had gone through it, they could never understand. So, talk about that aspect of forgiveness.
I think that's a really complicated word when it comes to people who've survived, who've lost everything and survived the kind of atrocities that my family did. And I actually talk about this in the book. My mother had a very strong faith. She actually raised me Christian,
Mm.
and for her, that was, and you read about that why in the book. But for her, forgiveness was a really important aspect of her life. And she was an extremely, despite what happened to her, she was a very optimistic person who I learned empathy from because she was always um, delivering casseroles to people who were sick. There were always people at our house around the table who were lonely, who were marginalized. So I think forgiveness or the permission to forgive for people who've experienced those atrocities belongs to them. I don't think my grandmother was able to forgive. She was actually a very so my the grandmother I grew up with, my biological grandmother was murdered. Um, but the grandmother I grew up with was a very bitter person, and I don't blame her for that, especially after I studied what happened to her.
Of
For
course.
me, forgiveness is really complicated, as anything in life, as is good as is evil. Like a Nazi SS officer saved my mother. He murdered people, but he saved my mother. And I think we like today to have everything simplified into very clear either or um, categories. And forgiveness, I think, is one of those categories. There's a spectrum on who is able to forgive and how we forgive. I certainly can't forgive the people who bulldozed through my mother's childhood and killed her mother.
You possibly can't be the same person before the book, before you started writing it. How different are you now?
Very different, I think. So before I started on this journey, I was a marketing executive, and people thought of me as a buttoned up person who didn't show much emotion. And up until recently, I would always say this hasn't affected me, but now I've been talking about it more to audiences around the world. It totally has affected me. My husband, in the 10 years it took me to research this book, he would wake me from nightmares constantly. Uh, I have definitely become more attuned to when I see other people who particularly refugees. I really feel for the more than 35 million refugees around the world today. So whenever I see somebody fleeing war or going through war, it affects me very deeply. My sister can't watch anything on TV connected to war still to this day. But for
Yeah.
me, it just brings back the importance of telling these individual stories because numbers, big numbers like more than 35 million refugees in the world today, they're just too big to grasp, as is 1.1 million people murdered in Auschwitz. And so every time I feel overwhelmed by the horror of what human beings are capable of doing to each other, but also the joy of learning more about heroes in war, I think it's so important for us to tell those individual stories. Because if you think of my grandmother, if I tell you that she used to collect shells with me on the beach, then you might think of an experience of someone in your family of doing that. And next time you see someone who's experienced war, you won't think of my grandmother as a survivor of war. You'll think of her as a grandmother who collects seashells with her daughter. So those individual stories are really important.
They sure are. Now, freedom of speech. Where's the line?
I'm really glad we live in a country where we can have freedom of speech. If you're talking about what we're seeing on university campuses today, is that what you're asking?
In
Do you want me
general.
to talk about?
Yeah.
So for me, the there's a line between freedom of speech and inciting violence, and so I I think we should all be allowed to protest, and particularly when we're passionate about something, to protest what we care about. But I think we need to draw at the line of inciting violence on other people. And we're seeing a lot of that in the world today, not just in college campuses, but we live in a world where people are in their own echo chambers on social media. During COVID, we were very isolated from one another, and we've got used to yelling at each other instead of talking to each other. And so I prefer to be inspired by groups of people who are organizations that are doing the hard work in conflict regions of talking across conflict zones. And I think we can learn a lot from groups like Seeds of Peace, um, the Parent Circle Alliance for Middle East Peace, who actually are doing the hard work, talking to people across conflict zones and teaching people those skills.
So, how did your family and your extended family handle this? Did it create conflicts? Were you obsessed with it? I mean, what was this like?
It's a really interesting question. So I published Irena's Gift in Australia, where I'm from, in July last year, and most people in my family haven't read the book. I think when trauma happens to you, it's really hard to read about it yourself. And it's easy to keep it behind that wall. So, and it's a difficult topic. There's a lot of hope in my book. As I said, I really like to focus on the heroes and what makes people go against the flow. But it's still a difficult book to read. But ultimately it's about messy, complicated families, and maybe those messy, complicated families don't want to read about themselves in a book. But my nieces have, and that's what's really important to me, because they didn't grow up with a lot of what I had to grow up with. The my mother sobbing behind the bedroom wall, my grandfather staring at a wall for days sometimes. And so for them to understand their own history and their own identity and to be able to come to terms with that is what's really important to me.
And what are you learning today?
I'm constantly learning. If we stop learning, if we stop being curious, then we'll end up back where we were in the 20s and 30s. I'm learning. I love hearing stories about people who are going against the flow. I talk to a lot to kids in schools, and I'm never, every single time, I'm surprised by their curiosity and the questions they ask and their willingness to learn. And I learn more from them than they learn from me, I think. They ask me the normal questions like, "Oh, was the Nazi who saved your mother a good person or a bad person?" And I love throwing that question back at them because I learn so much from their answers. And it makes me smile inside because I see them grappling with those complexities, those gray areas in life that we all need to lean into a little bit more instead of thinking in binary terms. Like, I remember the first time when a while after I moved to America, people would say to me, "You're a Republican or a Democrat." And where I come from, that's how you vote. That's not who you are. And today we want to categorize people and we want to categorize ourselves in these neat boxes, left or right, oppressor or oppressed. And what you learn in my story and what the kids learn from my story is life is not like that at all. And so we have to be curious. We've got to look into those gray areas and to really understand the truth.
Thank you for joining us on For Your Voice.
Thank you, Dustin. It was great to be here.